Okay, guys, so we're in the final scene now of the play itself, which is a hugely important one for obvious reasons. I think in terms of the overall structure of these culminating scenes, one of the important features of this that I think, offers an interesting comparison and contrast with Pinter is the absence or presence of heroes or redemptive figures in these final scenes. I think Petey in the birthday party is probably the closest thing that we come to a hero, and of course that's a sort of deliberately ironic, sort of pathetic hero. It's a deliberately kind of anticlimactic hero. And in Streetcar, most certainly there is a complete absence of heroes and simply really the scene of individuals victimizing one another. It's some weeks later, and it's important that we're kind of distant in time from the act of rape. We're distanced from it so that we can see the effect of this, the aftermath of this particular act of violent atrocity. Stella is packing Blanche's things, and the sound of water can be heard running in the bathroom. So again, there's this sort of the motif of purification and cleansing, and that Blanche's, the transformation hasn't really occurred in Blanche's habits. We see a loss of sanity on her part, but ultimately what that then means is that her previous habits are carrying on, and therefore her insanity is simply perhaps a development of an already pre-existing sort of disinclination to confront reality. The portieres are partly open on the poker player, so again there's the suggestion of vulnerability, and the suggestion of the poker game. Again, that it seems to be an ominous motif in the play, the poker game, and all of its symbolic connotations of life as a brutal kind of competition based on bluffing and based on evasion and based on gambling on the right side. That can be seen to symbolically represent the conflicts between Blanche and Stanley. Stanley, Steve, Mitch and Paolo sit around the kitchen table. The atmosphere of the kitchen is now in the same raw, lurid one of the disastrous poker night. So again, we've got this same connection between the intensity of the experience and the violence of reality. And then again, in terms of structure, that returning to the initial moment of violent disruption. So we've got, again, this sort of cyclical feature to the play's plot that I think is part of Williams' sort of cynicism and pessimism about the brutal nature of reality, that it will return to its kind of baseline, that we will come back to the reality itself. So there's this sort of rugged, prosaic materialism that's triumphant, I think, in this scene. Not necessarily because Williams sides with it, but I think because he accepts that is the changing tide of reality. The building is framed by the sky of turquoise, so I think there is this possibility of the colours maybe suggesting here a moment of calm. We are on the opposite side of the dramatic violence of the play. There's still enormous amount of tension in the incidents that occur in the final scene, but that colour, I think, suggests a moment of tranquility that I think only in the scene can be found through Blanche's entire dislocation from reality. That is ultimately what gives her a sense of, albeit compromised, tranquility. Stella's been crying as she arranges the flower dresses in the open trunk, so she's mourning this, the loss of her sister, and her identity. So there is an element of mourning here that, puts Stella in an incredibly difficult position in this play. She's forced with this choice of which side to kind of side with. They talk about the poker game, and Stanley says, drew to an inside straight and made it by God, and then says, maldita sea tu suerto. So there's this Spanish kind of curse that his friend Pablo utters on him for his luck. And again, I think it's important that the fortune seems to be shifting in Stanley's favour in the poker game as well. And then again, he says, put it in English, greaseball. So we see him enacting, I think, exactly the same kind of racial hostility that he's on the receiving end of previously in the play, and I think at previous moments is responsible perhaps for eliciting some form of sympathy from the audience for him. But here we see him dishing it out. We see him reciprocating, well, not even reciprocating, inflicting it on one of his supposed friends. And Stanley is prodigiously elated. You know what luck is? Luck is believing you're lucky. So again, he's got this sense of the forces of society are destined to be with him. I believed I was lucky. I figured that 4 out of 5 would not come through, but I did. But I would, and I did, and I put that down as a rule. To hold front position in this rat race, you've got to believe that you are lucky. And then Mitch says, you brag, bull. And I think there's a interesting moment here that offers an ironic kind of contrast to Blanche and Stella. We've got this ultimate belief in these violent characters like Stanley, that they are lucky, and that they believe their belief in their own luck is what ultimately makes them dominant. And I think there's an interesting comparison there with the way that power is represented in Pinter, that it isn't in and of itself really materially derived. It is derived from an element of almost psychological constitution and psychological inclination. But again, Mitch's inarticulacy, I think, perhaps allies him to Blanche in terms of his inability to reconcile himself to this reality. Stella goes into the bathroom, starts folding a dress, and Stanley says, "What's the matter with him?" And Eunice, walking past the table, says, "I always did say that men are callous things with no feelings, but this does beat anything. Making pigs of yourself." So again, she here, at this moment in time, seems to be exposing to us that, the animalized savagery of her behaviour. And then Stanley says, "What's the matter with her? How is my baby? Sleeping like a little angel." So there's this very deliberate gender contrast constructed here between the women and the men, with their violent, savage, competitive edge, and then the women with this, almost kind of angelic concern for the well-being of the baby. "I brought you some grapes." She puts them on a stool and lowers her voice. "Blanche, bathing, how is she?" She wouldn't eat anything but asked for a drink. So again, her evasive tactics are, completely intact and being used in tandem. She's bathing and drinking at the same time, which, we all might think sounds fantastic, but here they are her methods for evading and escaping reality. Stella says, "I just told her that. We'd made arrangements for her to rest in the country." There's this enormous sense of guilt at having lost, at Blanche having lost her mind, and you see that in the hesitancy of her language. Blanche opens the bathroom door and says, "If anyone calls while I'm bathing, take the number and tell them I'll call right back. Yes, that cool yellow silk, the boucle. See if it's crushed. If it's not too crushed, I'll wear it on the lapel. That silver and turquoise pin in the shape of a seahorse. You'll find them in the heart-shaped box I keep all my accessories in. Instead, try and locate a bunch of artificial violets in that box too, to pin with the seahorse on the lapel of the jacket." So there's this enormous sort of focus from Blanche on a kind of pointless sort of ornamentation of herself, decorating herself even in order to fulfill the needs of an imagined reality. She has entirely degenerated into a fantasy world here, and that is evident in the amount of effort that she's going to present herself in this fashion. She closes the door and Stella turns to Eunice, so they have this moment of honest discussion. And importantly, this is Stella's dilemma here. I didn't know if I did the right thing. What else could you do? And this is an important question for the dilemma of women. What are they meant to do in this case? What can they do in this scenario? And Stella says, "I couldn't believe her story and go on living with Stanley. Don't ever believe it. Life has got to go on no matter what happens. You've got to keep going." And so there is this, insistence on surviving and adapting, and not necessarily that, almost that it's a decision that is evading ethical and moral considerations, because in terms of it's almost a kind of utilitarian, pragmatic perspective here, is that what benefit is it for my child, for my baby, to suddenly lose its father and for me to be isolated on my own because of a moral principle? So there's a sort of utilitarian pragmatism about Stella's decision for life to go on, for her to actively accept that Blanche's story is not real, and therefore to actually consign Blanche by making that decision to basically, being ostracized by society. So she her refusal to believe the story basically itself plays a part in categorizing Blanche as insane. So she's this sense of Blanche and Stella both needing to adapt to shifting circumstances, and that that's important in terms of their overall fates. The bathroom door opens a little, and it's important that happens. Blanche just creeps. You cannot confront these changing circumstances, and this is represented through that fearful little opening of the door. She's looking out, and is the coast clear? Yes, Blanche. Tell her how well she's looking. Please close the curtains before I come out. So there's this hugely fearful, protective aspect to Blanche's sort of body language and characterization here, because she feels like she's being destroyed, and also feels very literally threatened by what's on the outside. They're closed. How many for you? 2, 3. So there's the sounds here, I think, create a sense of overlap between the poker game and Blanche's retreat. So there's this kind of overlap and retreat created through sound. And then Blanche appears in the middle of the amber light of the door. She has a tragic radiance in her red satin robe, and I think the colours here, it explicitly pinpoints her fate, and the colour is important, that it's actually, aligns itself with her desire that has partly led her to this tragic fate. Following the sculptural lines of her body, the Vesuviana rises audibly as Blanche enters the bedroom. So then again, there's this sense of precipitation of crisis as she moves towards the site of Stanley's rape. And she talks then with vaguely hysterical vivacity. I've just washed my hair. And she's talking here about her presentation. At the end, we see it's because of her delusion that she is going to be involved with Shep Huntley. And then she says, Shep Huntley, why not yet, honey? How strange. And at the sound of Blanche's voice, Mitch's arm supporting his cards is sagged and his gaze is dissolved into space. Stanley slaps him on the shoulder. So Mitch shares in this sense of tragic isolation here. And he, I think, is another character that loses out by this, this conflict of ideologies and values that's represented in this play. And that Stanley, violently tries to remind him of his need to react and to adapt to this changing reality through a stage direction. So Stanley says, hey, Mitch, come too. Tries to deliberately shake him out of any sense of empathy for Blanche. He wants him to re-immerse himself in his pragmatic understanding of reality. And the sound of this new voice shocks Blanche, so she doesn't even, the sense it's new, it's almost like she has blocked out Stanley's voice and shows us her sense of trauma, that she identifies him as new and strange to her at this moment in time. She makes a shocked gesture, which I think shows us this sense of devastation forming his name on her lips. She's terrified of the fact that he's there. Stella nods and looks quickly away, and I think her movements here show us her sort of convenient denial of what's going on. And Blanche then stands still for some moments, the silverback mirror in her hand, and a look of sorrowful perplexity as though all human experience shows on her fate. So this perhaps is a moment of, if we're talking about it in terms of tragedy, a moment of anagnorisis. There's some sense of, not even of her recognition of her flaws, but actually the recognition of humanity's flaws. And that sorrowful perplexity is actually not really technically anagnorisis, because it seems like she doesn't actually understand. But to the audience, there is this moment of at least revelation that through Blanche's trauma, we are talking about the grim tragedy of human existence, that we're doomed to dominate one another, and that domination is ultimately what drives the transformation of society. And she suddenly speaks with hysteria, says, what's going on here? Turns from Stella to Eunice and back to Stella, and her rising voice penetrates the concentration of the game. So there's this sense of her final kind of interruption of this material reality. And it's an interruption, I think, on the basis of trying to engender a sense of moral consciousness and guilt in these men, these participants. Stanley shoves back his chair as if about to rise, and Steve places a restraining hand on his arm. So there's this huge interpersonal tension here established between Blanche and Stanley at this moment in time, and that Steve is actually having to physically restrain him. And it makes him seem extremely brutal, that we can see from all the signs that Blanche is completely destroyed and disrupted, and that he still is hell-bent on creating this sense of destruction of her personality and her psyche. So Eunice, Stella and Blanche keep talking, and they keep convincing her that she looks wonderful, and then Blanche carries on describing this imaginary engagement with Shep Huntley that she believes she's going on. She says, "Yes, I will do. I'm anxious to get out of here. This place is a trap." And so this is an important description, I think, of her fate. To a certain extent, it is a trap, and I think that's why the stagecraft is so important throughout the play, that we see she's almost trapped inside the apartment. By virtue of being trapped there, she is trapped and vulnerable to all of those wider social forces that Williams represents through that kind of permeable boundaries in his mise-en-scène. And then Eunice sort of refuses to acknowledge this here and says, "What a pretty blue jacket. It's lilac colour. You're both mistaken. It's Della Robbia blue. The blue of the robe in the old Madonna pictures. Are those grapes washed?" So they're talking here about purity. And she's ironically deceived by the illusion she spun throughout the play. And so she talks here about her own clothing. In the old Madonna picture, she's got this desire here to purify herself even through her clothing, and that's why she then asks if the grapes are washed. It shows us, I think, her paranoia and desire for purity is expanded to reflect the sense of her, I think, of her guilt and taint, that there's this constant need to re-invoke her sense of purity. And she fingers the bunch of grapes. She's ultimately afraid of that sense of taint because it's become a central concept in the understanding of her own psyche. And then she wants to know if they're washed. She's concerned by their dirt, and she associates this with New Orleans, but actually it's also associated with themselves. Eunice says they're from the French market. That doesn't mean they've been washed. And then the cathedral bells chime, which is ominous in terms of its overall symbolic connotation. She says those bells, they're the only clean thing in the quarter. So there's this suggestion here of New Orleans and the forces of the 20th century being these kind of corrupting forces in society that are in some way tainting her. Well, I'm going now, I'm ready to go, and there's this huge kind of dramatic irony. And I don't think it's a coincidence that occurs at the moment where we hear the cathedral bells chime. It's this sort of chiming on the end of her life, where we know where she's going because Stella and Eunice have discussed this, that they're taking her away basically to a mental institution, and that there's this tragic lack of awareness on her part that she has no idea where she's going. I think that's different to Stanley Webber's fate in The Birthday Party because he has some kind of consciousness, I think, of his fate, but just cannot express it. So we never really know, and so we're actually alienated from understanding whether he is aware of his tragic fate or not. And it's important in terms of Pinter's representation of interpersonal relations that we never really know. And I think, the sympathy that Williams creates for her here is quite absolute, and I think it's the sympathy that's similar to Stanley Webber's abduction. Eunice is whispering she's going to walk out before they get here, so there's this sense of a conspiracy, which I think contrasts with Stanley Webber, who is both kind of mildly and passively defeated. He himself is passive in his own abduction, whereas here there's this sort of active conspiracy of the people on the side. Whereas Petey, Eunice and Stella contrast with Petey, because Petey, even though his resistance is kind of minimalistic and feeble, it's still a resistance in the mind, and that these guys are actually participating in the destruction of Blanche's identity. Blanche turns weakly and hesitantly about, and she lets them push her into a chair. And this is a moment, I think, where the similarities become more stark between her and Stanley. She's debilitated, and I think that offers us a connection, I think, quite literally with the motif of sitting that you see in The Birthday Party so frequently. This idea that somehow, if you sit down, you're making yourself extremely vulnerable. And then there's this long kind of monologue almost from Blanche, where she says, "I can smell the sea air." And this, I think, is the sea itself becomes a metaphor for her sense of tranquility and her escape that is only one in the mind, and that the only possible escape for her is a retreat into a fantasy world, a psychological fantasy world. She says, the rest of my time I'm going to spend on the sea, and when I die, I'm going to die on the sea. You know what I shall die of? She plucks a grape. I shall die of eating an unwashed grape one day out on the ocean. I will die with my hand in the hand of some nice-looking ship's doctor, a very young one with a small blonde moustache and big silver watch. Poor lady, they'll say, the quinine did her no good. And importantly here, she's completely plotted this kind of fantasy of her own mortality, which is her own escape. You know, her own escape here is an imaginative death. You know, an imaginative death that she plots, and I think the figurative connotations of the sea are that this is the only escape that's possible. The cathedral chimes are heard, and again we see these sort of ominous sound that keeps punctuating her story here. And I'll be buried at sea, sewn up in a clean white sack. And being buried at sea almost itself is a kind of contradiction, because you can't really fully be buried unless you're kind of weighed down and dragged into the water. And then a clean white sack, I think, obviously, again, in terms of colour, connotes this idea of her fascination with purity. And then it would be at noon in the blaze of summer, and into an ocean as blue as, chimes again, my first lover's eyes. So this escape is into a fantasy reconnection with that first lover that was lost to her initial source of reality. You know, her equation of this escape with her, you know, the young man that she's married to, who she was deeply in love with, I think shows us that this is the only source of tranquility for her, and it's the only way that she can overcome this kind of grim, compromised vision of reality. A doctor and a matron have peered around the corner of the building and climbed the steps to the porch, and I think, you know, it's important that we have these kind of institutional figures that connect us to Goldberg and McCann. You know, they are representatives of orthodoxy in society, but here of health. The gravity of their profession is exaggerated, and I mean that itself is a wonderful comparison with Goldberg and McCann, who carry this out on the level of language. The unmistakable aura of the state institution with its cynical detachment. Again, it's a brilliant connection to Goldberg and McCann, and the way that actually they are the ones that construct this sort of cynical detachment, and that we see that break down in that moment in Act 3, where they have to sort of convince themselves of their purpose in life, and that they have to actually mask the detachment that they go about actually deliberately creating for the rest of the play. And Eunice again is whispering to Stella, that must be them. Again, that sort of sinister whispering, I think, gives us a sense of conspiracy. And Stella presses her fist to her lips. So there's this is actually body language, you know, a piece of physical direction that Blanche utilizes a number of times throughout the play, and that there's this sense of tangible guilt, I think, on Stella's part through this. Blanche says, what is it? And then Eunice is affectedly casual. You know, she resorts to the flaws that Blanche exhibits throughout the play. So she's now in this kind of performative manipulation of reality in order to sort of usher Blanche away from this kind of threatening sense of menace. Blanche tensely says, I wonder if it's for me, and a whispered colloquy takes place at the door. So there's this huge sense of dramatic irony in that juxtaposition here, that she's tense and with almost perhaps fear and excitement in her fantasy vision, but then the whispering at the door reminds us of the plotting that's been carried out on her behalf. And Eunice returns politely. Someone calling for Blanche, and then she says, it is for me then. She looks fearfully from one to the other and then to the portier, the Vesuviana faintly plays. Is it the gentleman I was expecting from Dallas? And Eunice says, I think it is Blanche. So there's this engineering of reality to support her deception, you know, this deliberate fabrication of authenticity, of inauthenticity, I think gives us a clear connection to Goldberg and McCann again, and their hollow kind of engineering of Stanley's orthodoxy. And then Blanche says, I'm not quite ready, asking to wait outside. Eunice goes back to the portieres, and drums sound very softly. So again, those jungle drums that we heard in the previous scene, again are heard here, sounding very softly. Blanche says, still the toilet articles are still out, and they're waiting in the front house. Who's there? There's a lady with him. I can't imagine who this lady could be. How is she dressed? Just sort of a plain tailored outfit. Possibly she's... And then her voice dies out nervously. And again, she can't think of what to say here. She can't think of anything that would ally this story that Eunice and Blanche are telling her with reality. And so in that loss of plausibility, she loses her humanity. She's losing her ability to understand her connection with real life. Shall we go, Blanche? Must we go through the room? So there's a sense of evading the values clash, that the old South that she represents kind of willfully trying to hide from the new reality of industrialism and materialism that Stanley represents, and refusing to have this confrontation. And then there's an interesting comparison here where Blanche still is clinging on to her appearance, and these ladies deliberately engineer this sense of positive kind of self-image that offers an ironic contrast with Stanley Weber, who is sort of polished up and made to look presentable by his abductors, but he himself sees this as actually something that represents a violation of his integrity. Whereas here, Blanche, that violation of authenticity is precisely what she is deliberately and willfully engineering herself. So the contrast is in terms of who has engineered this sense of inauthenticity. Blanche moves fearfully to the portieres, and then Eunice draws them open for her, and Blanche goes into the kitchen. Blanche, to the men, then says, "Please don't get up, I'm only passing through." And so there's this faint sense of her invoking the sense of chivalry and politeness that she's so wedded to throughout the play, in this grimly kind of ironic set of circumstances, because the men are totally indifferent to these pretenses of genteel behaviour. And I think it's perhaps comparable to Petey's kind of muted protest, that there's this sort of sense of moral absolutism in both of those characters that goes basically completely ignored by the characters that are in the immediate surroundings. Goldberg and McCann in the birthday party, and then the poker players in the streetcar. She crosses quickly to the outside door. Stella and Eunice follow. The poker players stand awkwardly at the table, all except Mitch, who remains seated looking at the table. And I think there's a sort of determination in Mitch's behaviour to adhere to the principles that he thinks he's believed and acted on. Or, you may give this as a sense of guilt, his refusal to join in this sort of awkward, fake rendition of genteel behaviour, because it gives him, I think, a sense of faith in the appropriate nature of his decision. Blanche steps out onto a small porch at the side of the door. She stops short and catches her breath. And the doctor says, "How do you do? You are not the gentleman I was expecting." So again, her genteel vision is completely at odds with the reality that she finds herself in. There's an irony there. She suddenly gasps and starts back up the steps, and she stops by Stella. So there's this actual here. Interestingly, she sort of reverts to the track. She wants to go back. And I think that, again, offers an interesting contrast to Stanley, Weber, who has this conflicted, difficult relationship with, the boarding house, but in the end is ultimately kind of dragged kicking and screaming from it. She stops by Stella, who stands just outside the door, and speaks in a frightened whisper, "That man isn't Shep Huntley." And so there's this enormous sort of unravelling of the dramatic irony here, that, of course, she's unaware of the plotting that each of the other characters have carried out.